do it! Don't let your dreams be dreams. Yesterday said tomorrow. So just do it! Make your dreams come true!
Hello, and welcome to Screen Tones, where we talk anything and everything webcomics. Today, we're going to be talking about a social direction that can be equal parts intimidating and confusing for people posting their comics around the internet. I'm Delphina. My pronouns are she, her, and I make the webcomic Zombulus.
I'm Finn. I use they, them pronouns, and I make the webcomic Heirs of the Veil.
And I'm Ray. I use they, them pronouns, and I make the webcomics Overlord of Ravenfell and On Empyrean High.
And I'm Crispy. I use she, they pronouns, and I make the comics Ghost Junk Sickness and Lunar Blight.
Excellent. Okay. So now we're all doing our best to be respectful of different groups out there. It is never okay to be a phobic jerk, and there's all kinds of resources out there for making sure you're not doing something harmful that you do not intend with your work. But there's also a lot of challenging topics out there that you might want to talk about in your comic, and a lot of reasons people might get mad about the fact that you're even addressing them. There's a lot of nuance, and we probably won't be able to handle all of it in this episode, but we're going to address that fear of backlash that we're loosely calling purity culture in this context. So this is going to be an interesting one, I think. First, I want to kick it off by asking, like, how do you define purity culture? Let's start with Finn.
Yeah, I think purity culture to me is kind of something that a lot of the times comes from like good intentions. There is this certain idea of wanting to do what is right and correct in media or the media consumption, but it's kind of like you want a moral standard, but you're pushing that moral standard a little bit too far. I think purity culture for me is also often connected to harassment and harassment campaigns of like singular creators, and probably also the idea that singular creators have to be held to the same standard as like big corporations.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting too. And I definitely agree that a lot of times it's coming from a good place. It's coming from a place of wanting to protect people who you might perceive as needing to be protected from something. And just knowing that it, like, sometimes that can go in a direction that has the opposite effect, I think. What about you, Ray?
I think my first encounter with purity culture was probably the fundamental Christian type. I mean, I was there when LJ Strike Through happened, and there was actually a group that managed to get a bunch of just things banned, and it was both like good and bad. So it was one of those things that I've always viewed as some sort of moral absolutism. There's only black and white, there's no gray areas, and it's kind of like swinging a blunt object and hitting everything in that general direction. That can have a lot of collateral damage, I've seen. Like when the live journals strike through happened, there was a lot of support groups for people with trauma that ended up getting banned just as hard as the stuff that people would probably find morally objecting. So in my mind, it's just complete black and white thinking. Often it's a group organizing harassment against singular creators. I very rarely see it done against people that are actually in power and have like an institutional power that they wield. It's usually just small indie creators.
Oh gosh, the live journal thing, you sent me back several years. It was so bad. But yeah, it's absolutely this kind of black and white dichotomy, exactly like you're saying, and it can be very hurtful in another direction, when you really get like the mobs going with their pitchforks. It's not it's a very nuanced topic, and sometimes, oftentimes in an internet culture, we don't have that nuance to handle it. What about you, Crispy? How do you define purity culture?
I think Ray and Finn put it very perfectly with the lack of the nuance, like we're talking about a lot with the black and white thinking, and also the targeting of like individuals who do go into things. Now, later in the episode, we'll talk a little bit about like kind of like what are some sides to this, and like different angles, because there's a lot. It's not just one thing is bad, one thing is good, and stuff like that. Like these are representations of people's morals, like Ray said. But I think that in the context that we're talking about in purity culture with web comics and creating things and writing stories that make people uncomfortable, that make people have to face some fears that they have, what we're seeing is we are seeing those harassment campaigns. We are seeing, oh my God, Twitter user Spacey Kitty went onto Twitter and was like, wow, do not read the webcomic Space Cats Adventures with the Dragons, because that has a sad cat in it and they condone sad cats. And it kind of stems from that. Like that's a really very stupid kind of example, but its root of it is basically how a lot of things kind of blow up and stuff like that. So you don't have this conversation with other people. It's just like, whoa, this happened, guys, we got to do something about this. Like, let's go. And I think that it is very linked to our kind of social setting right now with how social media works. And I think it's a very intoxicating thing that I see people actually do to pursue followers, to get more noticed, and to kind of just be that white knight in a lot of situations. And it's kind of scary now being a creator, seeing how those things unfold and see how people get quote unquote canceled for some things that, I mean, in my opinion, what doesn't make sense for that to happen. But that's the key there, is that what I think isn't X is what something might think is Y, and kind of thing. So it's just like, how are we going to address this extremely nuanced topic that has so much to do with identity and morals and stuff like that, in a lot of assumptions? And that's my definition of purity culture. It feels like it's all over the place too because of how nuanced it is.
Yeah, I think adding to that, something that I see is also like adding to my own definition of purity culture as well. To me, a lot of the times, like this aspect of not having power. So you kind of try to assert power over other people who you might see on your own level or maybe a little bit below. And I think to like kind of justify this like power assertion or this harassment, you kind of try to put it into like this veil of morals. So you try to be like more pure than others, and I think that's also like this aspect, because I think we need to distinguish with purity culture, because Ray talked about like Christian fundamentalists, but what we see a lot today is that there are a lot of like marginalized young people that perpetuate this idea of purity culture. And I think like this aspect of being powerless and trying to have some power or to change something where you think you can change something is some like an aspect that I think is probably important in this discussion.
Yeah, I think the main difference that I'm seeing is, yeah, there are different people doing it. The language is actually relatively the same, but a bit more geared toward the kind of activist language and current lingo that we've used for that. So you have people that are likely asserting power, and I have seen some say that they actually go after smaller creators because they think that they're going to listen to them. Although I think the main problem with that approach is that there's no actual dialogue happening, because whatever the creator says often tends to be ignored.
And this just confirms that it's just like nuance, unfortunately, is just a topic that's escaping a lot of these circles. So this black and white thinking can be really actually harmful when you're approaching these deep and complicated subject matters. And like that's the biggest thing when you have like these stories that will cover certain aspects that do make people uncomfortable and stuff like that. Like it's always going to boil down to that intent of the piece and art in general, which we'll get into in a little bit. But that's the thing, is that there's just so many layers, there's so many sides and ways that this can kind of unfold. And one of the biggest things that we're talking about right now is a lot of the campaigns and the things that have happened to people in response to making stuff that they don't want to see or is not correct, and you know what is correct and what is moral, kind of thing. So it's swamplicated.
Yeah, and I think for me too, it's just we're all small creators here. We're all webcomic creators. None of us is Disney Marvel conglomerate like defining the cultural space or anything like that. We're all trying to tell stories that are important to us and do our own thing. And when someone kind of comes in there with the big hammer and says, "No, this is wrong," like that gets very discouraging very fast, because I it's not just my day job. It's not just like a thing that I can go home from or a job that I can quit. This is what I want to be doing. This is the story I want to be telling. And when somebody comes in and 30 people are in my DMs saying crappy things to me, like of course you don't want to do it. Of course you feel bad. And like that's I don't think that's affecting the change that they want to be affecting. So even from a standpoint of, yeah, it does feel like that white knighting, that power, that kind of and when you see somebody who is doing this all the time and kind of makes it like their thing to go like get angry at other people, then I'm like, are you even reading the web comic? Are you even like do you actually want to see this web comic get better, or do you want to knock this person down a peg? And that's kind of how I feel like that's the line there. I'm gonna throw it to you all too. Like, where's the line for you between healthy audience pushback and purity culture or drama or backlash that's harmful and discouraging to creators?
So for me, I think there's a distinction in how someone approaches my work and how someone tries to seek that sort of discussion or discourse that is within what I'm creating. I had people who are kind of like, were kind of weird about the comic. I had like a comment, for example, that with the kind of prologue of Heirs of the Whale, critiqued that the person with the darker skin tone is, in quotation marks, a servant to the person with the lighter skin tone. And that was like the extent of how they interacted. And after seeing that, they already kind of decided that the comic was bad and problematic without further engaging or giving me the chance to like kind of subvert their expectations. I think that is already something that like goes into the direction of purity culture thinking, because it's often very like black and white. And in the same regard, I had another person who kind of like, who I had a very interesting discussion about police brutality and general systems of power, who was someone who like actually engaged with the story and was interested on my take within the story. And that's kind of like a point of view that I had not considered for the part of the story where they commented on. So that's kind of like a respectful sort of pushback against what I had created there. And that's something that I wanted to engage with because they were respectful and didn't like try to basically come at me.
Did you have your hand up, Crispy?
I mean, I was basically gonna chime in and say that, to your point, Finn, the what you're describing a lot, just I think about the bad faith readers who are just kind of coming in being like, okay, it's time to make assumptions, and it's like the first thing that they're trying to just pick a fight with the work, and it's not up to these kind of weird standards that they've already set in the back of their head. It's that's unproductive. I'm sorry you went through that.
Yeah, that's a lot, and I feel like, especially with webcomic time, where it actually might take us a little while to like set up character dynamics and show things. Like, you do have to come into the medium with a little bit of good faith. You need to be able to say, "Okay, I'm trusting the author. I'm going to see how it goes," and you can stop at any time. There's a lot of comics there that are like, "This isn't really going the way that I want it to go, or it just doesn't feel right to me. I think the message here is not one that's working for me, or it kind of gets into some of my trauma that I don't want to be doing right now." Sometimes I'll stop reading a comic like that, but other times I'll just come back later and I'll like see, okay, I'll read it after a bunch of pages are there, and then I can get the entire shape of the story. And I think that would help a lot in cases where you do genuinely want to like enjoy the story, but there's something that you're not quite sure how they're going to handle it yet.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that like for us as webcomic creators, we have like a harder time in that regard because it takes us so long to sometimes come back to certain plot points and have everything revealed. Yeah, like Crispy said, people will make these assumptions and people will basically judge your work by things that have not already been established. So I think that for us, the fear to become like a victim of purity culture can be pretty prevalent because like webcomic time is a thing and we need such a long time to basically explain ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Ray? Where's the line for you between pushback and lashback, I guess, or backlash?
I think for me, it's they already have come in and decided exactly what I'm about. And often they assume things about me personally in a kind of parasocial way that just honestly might not be true. And I am also not obligated to give them any more information to either dash or complete that picture, in my opinion. And I think, honestly, the best part to do a healthy interaction is to create a dialogue, and so we can actually discuss maybe where I'm coming from or my intents, because most webcomics are a work in progress. You're seeing them real time without any editing, and maybe you could decide, oh, hey, I need to get sensitivity reader, or maybe I should show that this is not my views more obviously, or some sort of thing that I can workshop versus this is bad, you should stop doing it.
Yeah, gosh, it's just like I keep going back to the bad faith stuff, but like if you actually want to help people, you do need to make it a dialogue. You need to like and also, to your point, you don't need to reveal like your entire story. I wish more people could just like read a comic and say, wow, I don't know anything about that author. I have no idea what they're going through. So I can't make any kind of assumptions about like where they're coming from, because it can be very dangerous. Sometimes people are living in countries where, certain identities are illegal, and they can't be open about it. It's is like literally not possible without putting themselves in physical danger to be as open as people are demanding them to be. We all need to be a little more respectful about that on the internet, and like understand that people don't owe you that. People don't aren't always going to give you that. And if like that's really bothering you, you need to step back. That's your duty to step back and figure out what you want to do to either continue reading this or maybe not.
I think often of this mentality of like, well, it makes me uncomfortable, so the art piece needs to get punished and or go or leave or whatever. And there's like this dive into art, this experience that's so fundamentally different from each other, specifically when we interact with art. So when I read a comic, I'm going to be reacting differently from when Delphi reads a comic. Like, we're all unique in reactions as well. So it sets off moments and meetings and a whole load of reactions that range differently from viewer to viewer. So, with this in mind, no creator of set pieces will truly predict to the majority of folks looking at their art and how they will interact. So, I think it all comes down to the intent of the piece as well. An artist depicting a scene of pain and suffering, and as such was very famous during the 18th century Romanticism movement. It had the ability to, largely so, because of their canvas size, it was incredible to capture feelings of anguish and suffering of the time. And its purpose back then was to feel that terror of the aspects, to be transported to these subjects' like visceral last moments of confronting death. I always think of the Wrath of Medusa, but like, it's just insane. It's incredible. The moments and the meanings are intense, and when it was released during that time, people freaked out. People were like, "What the heck is this? This is horrible. Why are you doing this?" And that was kind of to the intent, where it's just like, yeah, it is scary, isn't it? Like, these people suffering, these people dying on this raft, like, oh my goodness. So you have this foreboding, intense, and dangerous feel coming from these paintings, and that's it. The intent there is key, as is your reaction to this piece. So to throw something aside, or in that case, to run to socials to cancel it, like, imagine, and they did during that time, run to papers and be like, the painting that was released, oh my gosh, like, wow, the insanity there, blah blah blah, just overreacting, but reacting as they do, as their morals have kind of imbued in them, and how they feel about these pieces. The unfortunate part is that when you do that, when you run to the tabloids, when you run to social media, and you have this like instant reaction to want to quote unquote cancel something because of such a reaction to that piece, to something so visceral or something like that, it it doesn't open discussions in a meaningful format with colleagues or peers about it. It doesn't help deconstruct the feelings that you've had experiencing something so grand. And again, it takes away the nuance between the intent, the creation of the piece, your reactions, and so on and so forth. And I apply that all the time with the art that I create, the art that I interact with, and the stories, and so on and so forth. And I always think, when you have these moments and you're just kind of like, ugh, like, I don't know if I like this, or, oh, what does that mean, or where are we going? What is the art trying to communicate to you at that point? And if your immediate reaction is, I'm going to Twitter, I don't know. I'm not a fan of that. I don't think it's a place to open a meaningful discussion. It would be different if you were like, I'm going to my peers and we're going to have a chat about this. It feels different when you run to an open social platform or some kind of forum that kind of instigates, guys, this is horrible. don't look at this. It made me feel bad. That's where the line gets drawn for me.
I totally feel this, because I think that in these kind of instances, people don't take the time to have some introspection, to look into themselves and think about, why does this make me uncomfortable? Instead of doing that, they blame the work for the discomfort. So it's also kind of like another sign of this like black and white thinking, so the nuance isn't there. And maybe because of this discomfort, you don't want to actually think about why it's so uncomfortable. And I think another aspect for me is also that a lot of the times this is kind of like connected to identity, because people often like get this discomfort if something is like very close to them or close to their experience, but it's like somewhat off or not exactly like they would expect it to be. So something I see a lot is people trying to police creators how to depict their own identities or their own experiences in their work, because it doesn't match up exactly.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the problems is a lot of people of like minority identities often are feeling like they can't express themselves in any way that's anything less than perfect. They don't want to make people uncomfortable, but honestly, sometimes us just being there makes people uncomfortable. And a lot of us feel like we can't tell our genuine stories without falling into this trap of being problematic or whatnot. Like, and like, as someone that is mixed race, I see a lot of my fellow Asian artists just feel like they can't tell their story because they're Asian American, so they're not authentic enough. Or I see a lot of people who want queer stories, but a lot of people feel like they shouldn't even be able to use the word queer. So it's really one of those things where it feels like often there's just no way to win, no way to make everyone happy, but also I don't think you need to make everyone happy.
I think it's key right there. You said that phrase, not feeling enough. And I think that's the battle that we're having here with creators on such a spicy topic, is the fact that when you have all of this in mind with everything that we said, and you come back to the creator's point of view, and you obviously don't want to rock the boat with some of the things that you want to depict, but it's still your experiences or still the stories that you want to tell with the certain characters and certain aspects and stuff like that. And I feel like a lot of times you want to avoid not being enough, not being ready enough to tell these stories, or good enough, or prepared enough and stuff like that, because you see this backlash. And that's that's the thing that makes me sad, is that I've had lots of conversations with folks being like, I want to put XYZ in it, but I feel like because I'm not the ultimate ambassador, I can't. And now this is not me saying like I'm going to do a story about someone else's experience and I don't know anything about it because that's not my experience, but I'm going to write about it. That's different. But when you have like some characters that aren't going to just be all about this certain experience that's not yours, I don't know. There's no perfect way to write, is the thing. I think that's the lesson that I want people to know, is that you're, unfortunately, you can't please everybody. So there's some nuance, there's some places where we got to step, and there's also some of that responsibility that we do have to accept with our writing, and some things that people, readers, need to understand to kind of step back from, because as Delphi said, you also have the option of just closing it and not reading it anymore if it's not to your kind of moral standards.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just personal responsibility is so key. not only in like deciding what you want to read, but how you want to read it. There's a lot of things that are upsetting to me that aren't as upsetting if I read it on mobile versus screen, because I can make the pictures smaller, so it's not like I'm not being hit full in the face with this thing. There's some things where like the amount of blood or viscera or something like that is like, whoa, that's beyond my level. But if I like make my screen desaturated, it's a little better. Like, and you know, just deciding when I do it, because if I'm at a raw place emotionally, maybe this is not the time to like go into something that's going to make it worse for me. Like, there's a lot of introspection, and that's what it all comes back to, I think, just kind of reader introspection and the role you have in engaging with art. And like you were saying before, Crispy, this is not a new thing. People have been outraged about all kinds of art way before our time. So this is not like a new internet thing that's happening, that you know, these kids these days or whatever, like this is the same old stuff that we've seen all throughout history in a different suit. So we're, you know, we got to peel that back a little bit. I think as readers, we need to like kind of focus on, why does this make me feel this way? Like, what is my real reason for wanting to go and tell a bunch of strangers about this thing? And is that valid, or is that kind of objective versus subjective? And that's a really hard call. That's not always something that you can tell, because 100% there are a lot of harmful stereotypes floating around out there, that perpetuate certain things that a lot of us would rather not have that happen. But they're also people's experiences. And so, especially in the context of web comics, we have a whole lot of responsibility, or like, I don't think we should be shutting people up about these things, because by and large, these stories need to be told. These stories, there's a lot of things that people are doing that are really important for other people to hear, so they know they're not alone.
And I think right there, Delphi, it's perfectly put, because webcomics are the medium to do that. It is like one of the most accessible ways for people to just literally dive in, start posting their comics online, and gather some people reading your stuff and your stories and stuff like that. So it's, to me and to all of us here, a very, very important medium to tell those parts of ourselves, and kind of even work through things. And all of our themes and statements and whatnot are always going to be different in like the stories that we tell. Even if I'm doing something that's about bounty hunters and sci-fi action, there's still a theme of self-acceptance that I want to explore. And there's going to be a lot of hard times in the story that reflect some of the really shitty emotions that people go through, and some of the really mean things that they say. And readers have reacted like, huh, gosh, wow, that was hard to read, or wow, whew, that was said, certainly. And I often think about the fact that I'm just like, yeah, the people who are creating these stories are still human. The people in these stories can be the same too, when you have that nuance, when you have those reactions and stuff like that in them. And I think that just makes it all the more like impactful. Like, that makes it very compelling to have something that does reach into those kind of deep crevices, or moments that you don't know if you do want to ask, or whatever. And one of my favorite things, actually, thinking about this, that I'm actually going into, is writing queer horror stories. And Lunar Blight, which is our other comic, is going to be diving a lot into that, having those identities and parts of ourselves, and having those questions, but in a horror setting. And I'm just like, this is something, yet again, that I would have loved kind of growing up, which is why that, we're writing it in the first place. And I think years ago, I would have been a little bit too afraid to go into it as much as we did now, because again, seeing that backlash. But talking to more of my peers and getting more in contact with the webcomic community made me realize people need this. I need this. And I gotta get a little messy.
Yeah, I think that's the appeal. I've also been getting a lot into more horror, going back to my roots. Um, and I think one of the appeals of it is I can explore dark and even maybe taboo subjects, but since it's fiction, we're doing it from a safe place, and it can actually help prepare or help people process certain things as well, reading darker fiction, and they can recontextualize maybe things that happen to them by doing so just through fiction and being able to control their own experience. That's one of the reasons why I love horror, and there's actually a lot of queer creators that have gone into that genre because of it as well. So it's definitely something that it has a place in our society, and it has reasons for being there, especially for people that are traditionally outcasts.
Yeah, I think art in general should be a reflection of the variety of emotions that humanity can produce. And sometimes these emotions will be ugly and difficult and not, I don't know, not be very nice to interact with, but it's still like a part of our experience that I think that fiction should encapsulate, because I don't know, it would be kind of boring if everything was just always pretty. And I sometimes feel a little bit disappointed by like the mainstream media, because there's this kind of sanitized view on the world that is more pretty than ugly. And I agree that like horror as a genre can do a lot about that, and shows a lot more of like the ugly sides. But what I was also thinking about, that a lot of the times when people get outraged about something that caused like difficult or complicated emotions within them, I feel that sometimes they don't realize the humanity of the creator, and to them it feels like that there's just someone out there who on purpose tried to hurt them or people like them. So I feel that's one of the reasons they lash out, and maybe also because they have never really learned to interact with media or art that is so complicated. Because I don't know like if I'm correct there, but in the last few years, especially because mainstream media seems so sanitized, I feel like there's not a lot of media, especially like for younger people, that is actually there to cause complicated emotions or make them think more about certain topics. Like, there's great media, but the complicated feelings and the ugly feelings I was talking about, I don't think that this is something that we see a lot at the moment.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point too, because if you get more of that media at a younger age, then you develop the taste for it. You develop like an ability to process it. But if you never get that, if all of your stuff is fed through like Disney or whatever, and it's super sanitized and only addresses like the safest of safe topics, then how are you ever going to appreciate something more nuanced? That's never going to happen because you never had time to do that. And so you're going to like go from like the super cutesy stuff to like some really crazy stuff and not know how to process it. It's just very interesting to me. So let's say I'm making something and it's not going to be pretty. It's going to be very ugly, very rough, very challenging material, but I am terrified because I see all of the people who get angry on Tumblr or Twitter or wherever, that they're going to jump down my throat, send me lots of DMs and hate mail, and I'm gonna get depressed and stop. What is your advice to like get through that? What do you do if you're afraid of that kind of reaction?
So I don't know if I have like any good advice, because that situation is terrifying, and I know a lot of people feel kind of paralyzed thinking about that this is something that might happen to them. But on the other hand, I think it's always important to remember that a lot of webcomic creators are not big creators. I mean, it sounds probably a little bit sad, but you will probably not reach an audience that will cause such an outrage on such a large scale. You will probably get the odd comments, but for the most part, you have to remember you will probably not get a lot of people who would be willing to create a hate mob to like cancel you or to get your story off the internet, because most webcomic creators, unless they get like really big, don't attract that kind of audience. And even though this kind of like purity culture is something that we see a lot nowadays, I still do feel that most people who interact in the webcomic community are kind. Like, maybe I'm a little bit naive there, but I think most people are not terrible and will probably not come after you. Because that's also something I feel, is that many of these targeted harassment campaigns are a lot of the times not only caused by the story itself, but because someone has like a problem with the creator or wants to make an example of them. So to do that, the creator has to have like a certain like public presence.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good point. I like because you can see some of these things that snowball on Twitter and whatever, but I think a lot of them are like done in a day or whatever. People move on even when that happens, but for the most part, it I don't think it's going to happen at the frequency that you might fear if you're looking from the outside in. So it's always best to shoot your shot. How about you, Ray? What do you think? What's your advice for somebody who's doing something a little messy, but they're scared of the backlash?
I would say do not write for the bad faith reader. At best, you'll come out with something sanitized and Disney like if you do, and you can't compete with Disney, I'm sorry. I would say you should look at your audience, decide what exactly you want for your ideal audience member, and write for them. And anyone else that has a bad faith take just isn't really worth engaging with. And I would also say just be block happy for your personal social media and curate your space to the way that you want it exactly, which can allow for dissenting opinions, but only ones that are respectful. That would be my advice. I would also say maybe try not to take things too personal. For instance, if you have a review of your comic, I personally do not read reviews of my comic because I am not the target audience of the reviews. And that personally just gives me a lot of peace of mind in itself.
Yeah, having that peace of mind is so important. And to your point about bad faith people, like if they're not reading your comic, like why are you catering to them? Nothing that you're going to do to your comic is going to make them read it. So it almost seems kind of backwards to be like, oh yeah, well, we're writing about puppies now because we can't do anything else. So yeah, I mean, there are people who are out there who want and sometimes need your view, and being able to put that out there is more important. How about you, Crispy? What's your advice to someone who's afraid of the backlash?
For me personally, I'm actually gonna read a little bit of a quote from Guillermo del Toro from his movie Pinocchio. He says that these are times that demand from kids a complexity that is tremendous, far more daunting, I think, than when I was a child. Kids needs answers and reassurances. For me, this is both children and adults that talk to each other. It tackles very deep ideas about what makes us human. And I think about that a lot because it's the complexities that I latch onto. It's the darkness, it's the images that are quite frightening in a lot of his works that resonate with me growing up with that too. And those are the things that I needed. And when I hear creators talk about things that they didn't feel like they could talk about because it wasn't puppies in the Starbucks AU, they didn't want to tell these stories that other people still needed to hear. And that is the whole basis of this. Your story exists because somebody does need to hear it. And I think one of the most incredible things that I've actually had happen writing Ghost Junk Sickness with Space is having people say how much they needed to hear some words, or how much they needed to have these really deep, kind of dark moments happen in the story. And it's really, really, really scary when that happens, when you're uploading these updates and you're tackling something that's pretty dark, pretty visceral. But I promise you, in the end, it's going to be worth it. I promise you, when you get to a point where you're the most open with your feelings on something that's so raw, happening in your story, that touches on something that is so incredibly intense, I promise you that when you get out of that, you're gonna not regret it. You won't regret it. It's going to be worthwhile. All of that fear and that pain, and that's something that I think is with every artist. That fear of showing your vulnerabilities is key to making you an artist. And I think embrace it. Please. People really need you to be genuine with your work, for you to be genuine with your audiences. And this is something I want people to embrace, and something that I am seeing is being lost again because of the platforms that we have. So embrace that vulnerability. It will be worth it.
I definitely think that we do need to be more vulnerable and more genuine. And in platforms where everything's just bite-sized pithy quotes and fun little quips, that can be really hard to be truly genuine. But I think especially right now, in these days, we definitely do need people to be a bit vulnerable and open about their work, and art is probably the best way to do that right now.
Yeah, I also think as a creator, I know that like negative comments and things that don't feel good, that these are things that stick with us like for a long time. But like Crispy said, there will be people who enjoy your work and who will connect with it and who will be touched by it. And maybe that's like a sort of advice I want to also give, is that like try to focus on the people who really connect with your work, and try to focus more on these positive or more constructive voices that want to actually engage with your work and not just throw it away after one bad faith glance at it.
Tying into that, like, I've been around reading webcomics for several years now. There's a lot of times where I've seen people stop. I've seen people stop their comics and just say, you know what, I really can't do it. I don't think anybody cares anymore or whatever. And then all of these people will come out of the woodwork in the comments to say, oh my gosh, I never commented before, but this work meant a lot to me, and I'm really sorry to see it go. I'm really sorry it got to that point. So if you're a reader of web comics, like, don't be shy. That's another type of vulnerability too. But like, if you can go in and say, wow, this meant a lot to me, I guarantee you that will be the fuel that will keep someone going for sure. It's not all on the creator too. I think audiences can really do a lot to make sure that the stories they want and need are in the world, even if they're messy. And there's a lot of corporations out there doing this kind of stuff way worse. They are not even a little bit concerned about nuance or who they hurt when they put their stories out there. That makes me angry. That makes me want to tell these kinds of stories that are more accurate and more sincere. And I think whatever you do, whatever you put out into the world that comes from a place of sincerity, like we're saying, that's genuine, is going to be amazing. And it's worth doing, and it's worth putting out into the world. So yeah, with that, I think we're almost out of time here. We've covered a lot of stuff. There's definitely more stuff to cover. So if you're inspired by this, please let us know, because it's something that's been on a lot of our minds about the creation process. But yeah, do your thing, even if it's a little messy, even if it's going to challenge people, it's going to be good. Anyway, I have been Delphina, and you can find my webcomic Sombulus at sombulus.com.
I've been Finn, and you can find my webcomic at heirsoftheveil.com.
And I'm Ray, and you can find my comic at empyreancomic.com, and you can find Overlord of Ravenfell on Webtoon.
And I'm Crispy. You can find my comics at ghostjunksickness.com and lunarblight.com. Bark, bark, Starbucks.
Starbucks.
Bow, wow.
Oh gosh.
That's my coffee shop AU for dogs. Yes, the pure dogs who have the coffee shop AU.
I mean,
dogs
are
Thank you for listening to Screen Tones, a webcomic podcast. Want to know some other ways to support us? Check out our Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/ScreenTonesCast, where your support will help us create more episodes, reach cool extra bonus goals, and keep us talking about anything and everything webcomics. You can also find us on Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and our Discord server. Thank you so much for listening, sharing, rating, and supporting, and we'll see you next time.